Do you have any proof you were actually there? The question hit the humid Normandy air like a slap. Captain Bradley Morrison, 29 and assigned to coordinate the 80th D-Day anniversary ceremony, stared skeptically at the frail man in the worn suit standing before the memorial registration table. Morrison's crisp army dress uniform gleamed with fresh ribbons and polished brass, a testament to his rapid rise through the ranks in peacetime operations. Behind him, the sprawling Normandy American cemetery stretched toward the horizon, its white marble crosses standing in perfect formation like silent sentinels over sacred ground. The old man before him appeared to be in his late 90s, his frame bent by nearly a century of life. His hands, spotted with age and marked by countless years of hard work, trembled slightly as he clutched a faded manila envelope. He wore a simple gray suit that had clearly been his best once upon a time, though the fabric had grown thin and the cut seemed decades out of style. Most telling of all, there wasn't a single military decoration visible anywhere on his person. No ribbons, no medals, no pins to mark service or sacrifice. "Irel," the old man began, his voice barely above a whisper. The words came slowly, as if each one required great effort. "I was with the 1116th Infantry Regiment, 29th Division, first wave at Omaha Beach." Morrison's expression hardened. He'd heard this story before, or variations of it, from old men seeking attention at military ceremonies across Europe. The 80th anniversary of D-Day had brought them out in droves, wannabes, glory seekers, and confused elderly people who had somehow convinced themselves they'd participated in the greatest military operation in history. "Sir," Morrison said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone he'd perfected for dealing with difficult civilians, "the 116th took massive casualties at Omaha. The survival rate for the first wave was less than 10%. Do you have any documentation? Military records? Discharge papers? Anything to substantiate this claim?" Behind Morrison, the ceremony preparation was reaching fever pitch. It was June 6, 2024, exactly 80 years since Allied forces had stormed the beaches of Nazi-occupied France. World leaders were scheduled to arrive within hours. The President of the United States, the President of France, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and representatives from every nation that had participated in Operation Overlord. The media presence was massive, with news crews from around the world setting up their equipment along the bluffs overlooking Omaha Beach. The old man fumbled with his envelope, his arthritic fingers struggling with the clasp. "I have some things here," he said quietly. "Pictures, letters." Lieutenant Colonel Jessica Barnes, Morrison's superior and the overall coordinator of the American delegation, approached with quick, efficient steps. At 45, she was career military through and through, West Point graduate, Iraq and Afghanistan veteran, and someone who had built her reputation on flawless execution of high-profile events. She had neither the time nor the patience for disruptions. "Captain Morrison," she said crisply, barely acknowledging the old man's presence. "We have a situation developing with the French security detail, and I need you to—" She stopped mid-sentence as she noticed the civilian. "What's this about?" "This gentleman claims he was at D-Day, ma'am," Morrison replied, his tone making clear what he thought of the claim. "He's asking to participate in today's ceremony, but he has no credentials, no proof of service." Barnes looked the old man up and down with the quick, dismissive assessment of someone accustomed to making rapid decisions. She saw what Morrison saw, an elderly civilian in shabby clothes, probably suffering from the kind of memory issues that led old people to insert themselves into historical events. The last thing they needed today was a confused senior citizen disrupting a ceremony that had taken months to plan and coordinate. "Sir," Barnes said, not unkindly but with absolute finality, "today's ceremony is restricted to verified veterans, their families and official dignitaries. If you'd like to pay your respects, the public viewing areas are clearly marked, but I cannot allow unverified individuals into the restricted areas." The old man looked past them toward the beach below, where temporary bleachers had been erected for the honored guests. His eyes seemed to see something beyond the present moment, something that existed only in his memory. "I was 19, he said softly, speaking more to himself than to them, scared as hell. The landing craft was taking water, and we could hear the 88s already firing. Sergeant McKenna was praying the rosary. Tommy Kowalski was throwing up over the side." He paused, his voice catching. "Most of them never made it off the beach." Morrison exchanged a glance with Barnes. The details were oddly specific, but that proved nothing. Anyone could research the D-Day landings online and memorize enough facts to sound convincing. "What's your name, sir?" Barnes asked, pulling out her tablet to check it against the official registry. "Frank Sullivan," the old man replied. "Private First Class Frank Sullivan, 116th Infantry Regiment, Company A. Barnes's fingers flew across the tablet screen, accessing the digitized military records that had been compiled for the anniversary. The database contained the names of every verified D-Day veteran, cross-referenced with military personnel files, discharge records, and historical unit rosters. After a moment, she looked up with a mixture of surprise and suspicion. "There is a Frank Sullivan listed in the 116th Infantry records," she admitted. "But that doesn't prove you're him. The real Frank Sullivan would be 99 years old, and according to this record, he was listed as missing in action after the initial assault. Presumed dead." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Morrison stepped closer, his suspicion now openly hostile. "So you're claiming to be a dead man?" Morrison asked, his voice dripping with disbelief. "This is exactly the kind of stolen valor case we're trained to watch for. You've probably been telling this story for years, haven't you, living off the heroism of better men?" The accusation of stolen valor was perhaps the most serious charge that could be leveled at someone claiming military service. It was a federal crime to falsely claim military decorations or service, and Morrison had been trained to spot the signs. In his mind, this was a textbook case. An elderly man with no documentation, claiming service in a unit that had been decimated, with no witnesses to corroborate his story. Frank Sullivan's shoulders seemed to sag under the weight of the accusation. He looked down at his envelope, then back up at the two officers with eyes that held decades of pain. "I was never declared dead," he said quietly. "I was captured, spent 2 years in a German prison camp. When I got back, nobody cared much about what had happened to the men who survived. We were just supposed to go home and forget about it." Barnes checked her tablet again, scrolling through additional records. "There's no record of you being a prisoner of war. No record of repatriation. According to official Army records, Private Frank Sullivan died on Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944. "The records are wrong," Frank said simply. Morrison had heard enough. The old man's story was falling apart under even basic scrutiny, and they had real work to do. The ceremony was less than 3 hours away, and they still had security protocols to finalize, VIP arrivals to coordinate, and a dozen other critical tasks. "Sir," Morrison said, his voice taking on an official authoritative tone, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave the restricted area. If you continue to persist with these false claims, I'll have no choice but to contact the French authorities and have you removed from the site entirely." A small crowd had begun to gather around the confrontation. Other veterans, many in their 90s and accompanied by wheelchairs and oxygen tanks, watched with troubled expressions as one of their own was publicly challenged and dismissed. Families of veterans, dressed in their finest clothes for the solemn ceremony, looked on with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. Among the observers was a young woman named Emily Chen, a military historian and documentary filmmaker who had been given special access to record interviews with D-Day veterans. She had her camera rolling, initially planning to capture candid moments before the official ceremony began, but now she found herself documenting what appeared to be either a tragic case of mistaken identity or a cruel example of stolen valor. Frank Sullivan tried once more to open his envelope, his fingers fumbling with the clasp that seemed determined to defeat him. "Please," he said, looking up at Barnes and Morrison with eyes that held no anger, only a deep sadness. "Just look at what I have. That's all I'm asking." "We don't have time for this," Barnes replied curtly. She gestured to 2 military police officers who had been assigned to crowd control. "Sergeant Williams, please escort this gentleman to the public viewing area. Make sure he understands that he's not to return to the restricted zone." The 2 MPs, both young enlisted men who had been taught to follow orders without question, moved toward Frank Sullivan with polite but firm determination. They were prepared to physically remove him if necessary, though they hoped it wouldn't come to that. The optics of manhandling a 99-year-old man would be terrible, especially with cameras present. But as they reached for Frank's arms, Emily Chen made a decision that would change everything. She had been filming the entire encounter, and something about the old man's demeanor bothered her deeply. She had interviewed dozens of D-Day veterans over the past year, and she had learned to recognize certain qualities that marked genuine combat veterans, a particular way of holding themselves, a specific type of trauma that lived behind their eyes, and most importantly, a reluctance to glorify their experiences. Frank Sullivan displayed all of these characteristics. More than that, the details he had mentioned, Sergeant McKenna, Tommy Kowalski, the specific problems with the landing craft, weren't the kind of information someone would find in a casual internet search. They were the kind of intimate, personal details that only someone who had actually been there would remember. "Wait!" Emily called out, stepping forward with her camera still rolling. She addressed Barnes directly. Colonel, before you have him removed, can I ask you something? Have you actually looked at what he's trying to show you? Barnes turned toward Emily with visible annoyance. And you are? Emily Chen, military historian and documentary filmmaker. I have Pentagon credentials for this event. She held up her press badge. Colonel, I've been interviewing D-Day veterans for the past 18 months, and I've learned to recognize certain things. This man's behavioral patterns are consistent with genuine combat trauma. The details he's mentioned aren't common knowledge. They're the kind of specific personal memories that only someone who was actually there would have. Morrison was having none of it. Ma'am, with all due respect, you're not qualified to make that determination. We have strict protocols for verifying veteran status, and this individual doesn't meet any of the criteria. Then what's the harm in looking at what he has in that envelope? Emily pressed. If he's lying, you'll prove it in 30 seconds. If he's not, she let the implication hang in the air. Barnes was clearly torn between her duty to maintain security and the growing realization that they might be making a serious mistake. The presence of the camera was also a factor. If they were wrong about Frank Sullivan, the footage of his humiliation would be a public relations disaster. 30 seconds, Barnes said finally. Show us what you have. Frank Sullivan's hands were shaking more noticeably now, whether from age, emotion, or the stress of the confrontation. He managed to open the envelope and carefully withdrew its contents. The first item was a small, faded photograph no bigger than a postcard. He held it out with trembling fingers. Emily leaned in to get a better look with her camera, and what she saw made her gasp audibly. The photograph showed a group of young soldiers, all wearing the distinctive uniforms and equipment of World War II infantry. They were standing in front of what appeared to be a landing craft, their faces a mixture of determination and barely controlled terror. At the bottom of the photo, someone had written in faded pencil, Company A, 116th Infantry, June 5, 1944, comes last picture before the beach. But it was the face circled in the same faded pencil that made Emily's heart race. Even allowing for nearly 80 years of aging, the features were unmistakably those of the old man standing before them. My God, Emily whispered, zooming her camera in on the photograph. Colonel, you need to see this. Barnes took the photograph and examined it closely. The uniforms, the equipment, even the quality and style of the photograph itself were clearly authentic. More importantly, the young man circled in the picture bore an undeniable resemblance to Frank Sullivan. But Morrison wasn't convinced. Anyone could have gotten hold of an old photograph, he said. This doesn't prove anything. Frank Sullivan reached into his envelope again and withdrew another item, a small battered notebook. The cover was water-stained and faded, and the pages were yellow with age. With infinite care, he opened it to a specific page and held it out. The page contained a handwritten list of names, written in the same faded pencil as the photograph notation. At the top, someone had written, Company A roll call, June 6, 1944, 0630 hours. Below that were dozens of names, with notations next to each one. Some were marked KIA, killed in action. Others were marked WIA, wounded in action. A few were marked MIA, missing in action. Halfway down the list was a single entry that made Barnes' blood run cold. Sullivan, Frank, mine, MIA/POW. The handwriting was clearly from the 1940s, written with the kind of fountain pen that had been standard military issue during World War II. More importantly, the notebook itself showed every sign of having survived 80 years of careful preservation. The water stains were consistent with exposure to seawater, and the fading was exactly what would be expected from a document of that age. Emily was now filming everything in close detail. Documenting what was rapidly becoming clear was a profound injustice. There's more, Frank said quietly, reaching into the envelope one final time. What he withdrew was a single dog tag, tarnished with age but still readable. The metal had been bent and scarred as if it had seen combat, but the stamped information was clear. Sullivan, Frank J. 3784759, BRC. Barnes took the dog tag and examined it carefully. The metal was correct for the World War II period, the stamping style was accurate, and the serial number format matched military records from that era. Most convincingly, the wear patterns on the tag were consistent with someone who had actually worn it in combat conditions. Morrison was still skeptical, but his confidence was beginning to waver. These items could have been acquired from estate sales, military surplus stores. Captain, Barnes interrupted, her voice carrying a warning. She was beginning to realize the magnitude of their potential error. This evidence appears to be authentic. Frank Sullivan looked up at them with eyes that held no triumph, no satisfaction at being vindicated. Instead, there was only a profound weariness and something that looked almost like disappointment. "I didn't come here to prove anything to anyone," he said quietly. "I came here to say goodbye to my friends. Most of them are buried in that cemetery up there. I wanted to tell them I made it, that I remembered them." The words hit like a physical blow. Here was a man who had survived one of the most brutal battles in human history, who had endured 2 years in a Nazi prison camp, who had lived with the trauma and survivor's guilt for 8 decades, and their first instinct had been to call him a liar. Emily Chen realized she was documenting something extraordinary. Not just the authentication of a D-Day veteran, but a profound lesson about assumptions, respect, and the danger of judging people by their appearance. But Frank Sullivan wasn't finished. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew one final item, a small leather-bound journal. This one was in even worse condition than the notebook, with water damage and age having made some pages barely legible. "I kept a diary," he said, opening it to a specific page. "Started it in basic training, kept writing in the prison camp, using whatever scraps of paper I could find." The page he showed them was dated June 6, 1944, and the entry, written in the same hand as the other documents, made Emily's eyes fill with tears as she read it through her camera's viewfinder. "We hit the beach at 0630. Sergeant McKenna got cut down before he made it 10 yards. Tommy threw up all over himself in the boat and then got shot in the head before he could even be embarrassed about it. I don't know how I made it to the seawall. God, I don't know why I made it, when so many better men didn't. The sand is red with blood, and the water keeps washing the bodies back and forth. I can hear wounded men calling for their mothers. I don't think I'll ever stop hearing that sound." The journal entry continued for several pages, describing in heartbreaking detail the chaos, terror, and massive casualties of the Omaha Beach landing. It wasn't written with the detached perspective of a historian or the glorified heroism of a movie script. It was the raw, immediate account of a terrified teenager witnessing the worst day in human history. Barnes was now pale, clearly realizing that they had made a catastrophic error. But before she could speak, the situation took another dramatic turn. A black sedan with government plates pulled up rapidly beside the registration area. Out stepped a man in an army-dress blue uniform. But this wasn't just any officer. The eagles on his shoulders marked him as a full colonel, and the ribbons on his chest told the story of a combat veteran with multiple deployments. Colonel Michael Hartley, age 55, was the Pentagon's official liaison for D-Day anniversary events, and he had been monitoring radio communications from the ceremony site. He had heard reports of a situation involving an elderly man claiming to be a D-Day veteran, and something about the description had triggered a memory. Hartley approached the group with quick, purposeful strides, his eyes immediately focusing on Frank Sullivan. "My God," Hartley said, his voice filled with awe. "You're really him. You're Frank Sullivan." Barnes and Morrison both turned toward Hartley with confusion. "Sir, do you know this individual?" Barnes asked. Hartley's expression was a mixture of reverence and excitement. "Colonel, this man is a legend. Not just a D-Day veteran, he's one of only 12 survivors of the first wave at Dog Green sector of Omaha Beach. 12 men out of 200 who made it past the seawall." He turned to face Frank Sullivan, and in a gesture that would be replayed on news broadcasts around the world, Colonel Hartley came to rigid attention and delivered a crisp military salute. "Mr. Sullivan," Hartley said, his voice carrying across the now silent crowd that had gathered to watch the confrontation. "It is an honor and a privilege to meet you, sir." Frank Sullivan, clearly overwhelmed by the sudden change in his treatment, managed a small nod. "Thank you, Colonel." Hartley lowered his salute but remained at attention. "Sir, for the past 15 years, military historians have been trying to locate the survivors of Dog Green. We knew from German records that some Americans had been taken prisoner from that sector, but the German records were incomplete. We had names but no way to verify who had actually survived." He gestured toward the cemetery on the bluff above them. "Mr. Sullivan, there's a memorial stone up there with your name on it. You've been listed as killed in action for 80 years. The revelation hit Frank Sullivan like a physical blow. For 8 decades, he had believed that his survival was known, that someone somewhere had recorded the fact that he had made it off the beach. To learn that he had been officially dead all this time, that his sacrifice and survival had been forgotten, was almost more than he could bear. Emily Chen was now crying openly as she filmed, realizing that she was documenting not just a case of mistaken identity, but the resurrection of a man who had been officially erased from history. Colonel Hartley turned his attention to Barnes and Morrison, and when he spoke, his voice carried the cold authority of senior command. "Colonel Barnes, Captain Morrison," he began, his tone making clear that this was not going to be a pleasant conversation. "Can you explain to me why a Medal of Honor candidate was being escorted off the premises by military police?" The words Medal of Honor candidate hit like a thunderbolt. Barnes felt her career prospects evaporating before her eyes. "Sir, we had no way of knowing," Morrison began, but Hartley cut him off. "You had no way of knowing because you didn't bother to look at the evidence he was trying to show you," Hartley replied coldly. "Mr. Sullivan has been carrying documentation of his service and survival for 80 years, and your first instinct was to assume he was a liar." Hartley turned back to Frank Sullivan, his voice softening. "Sir, there are some people here who have been waiting a very long time to meet you." From the direction of the cemetery, a small group of people began walking toward them. Leading the group was an elderly woman, probably in her 70s, leaning heavily on a walker. Behind her were several middle-aged adults and a few teenagers. "Mr. Sullivan," Hartley said gently, "I'd like you to meet Sarah McKenna Collins. Her grandfather was Sergeant Thomas McKenna of Company A, 1116th Infantry." Frank Sullivan's eyes widened as he stared at the approaching woman. "Tommy's granddaughter?" Sarah McKenna Collins was crying as she made her way slowly toward Frank. "My grandfather talked about you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "He made it off the beach, but he was wounded badly. Before he died in the field hospital, he told the chaplain about a young soldier named Frank Sullivan, who had helped carry wounded men to safety. He said you saved at least a dozen lives that day." Frank was now crying as well, the weight of 80 years of survivor's guilt finally beginning to lift. "Tommy made it? He survived the beach?" "He lived for 3 days in the field hospital," Sarah replied. "Long enough to tell the chaplain about the heroes he had seen. Long enough to make sure your story was recorded. The chaplain wrote it all down, but the records were lost when the field hospital was bombed." Hartley stepped forward again. "Mr. Sullivan, Sergeant McKenna's account of your actions on Omaha Beach is why you're being considered for the Medal of Honor. The Army has been trying to verify his story for decades, but without a surviving witness, they couldn't make the recommendation official." Frank Sullivan was now sobbing, 8 decades of pain and guilt pouring out of him. "I thought I was a coward," he whispered. "I thought I had failed them. I thought I should have died with them." Emily Chen was still filming, but she was barely able to hold the camera steady through her own tears. This wasn't just a story about military valor. It was about the power of memory, the importance of bearing witness, and the healing that comes from finally being recognized for sacrifices made long ago. Colonel Hartley addressed the now large crowd that had gathered around them. Military personnel, veterans' families, media representatives, and ceremony staff all stood in respectful silence as one of the last living links to D-Day was finally welcomed home. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hartley announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the gathering, "you are witnessing history, not just the authentication of a D-Day veteran, but the return of a true American hero." He turned back to Frank Sullivan. "Sir, if you're willing, the President of the United States would be honored to meet you. He's scheduled to arrive in 2 hours, and I can guarantee that you'll have a place of honor at today's ceremony." Frank Sullivan looked around at the faces surrounding him, faces that had gone from suspicion and dismissal to awe and respect in the span of an hour. He saw Barnes and Morrison both looking stricken with shame and regret. He saw Emily Chen still filming and crying. He saw Sarah McKenna Collins and the other family members of his long-dead comrades. "I just wanted to visit my friends," he said quietly. "I just wanted to tell them I remembered them." "Then that's exactly what we're going to do," Hartley replied. "But first, there are some other people you need to meet." Over the next hour, as word spread through the ceremony site, Frank Sullivan was reunited with descendants of other members of Company A, 116th Infantry, children and grandchildren of men he had known as teenagers, men who had died in the surf at Omaha Beach, or lived just long enough to tell their families about the young soldier who had tried to save them. Each reunion was documented by Emily Chen, who realized that her simple documentary about D-Day anniversary events had become something much more profound, a story about memory, recognition, and the healing power of finally being able to tell your story. But the most powerful moment came when Colonel Hartley personally escorted Frank Sullivan to the cemetery overlooking Omaha Beach. There, among the thousands of white crosses marking the graves of American servicemen, they found Section D, Row 15, where a small memorial stone bore the inscription, "PFC Frank J. Sullivan, 116th Infantry, killed in action June 6, 1944. Frank Sullivan stood before his own gravestone for a long time, his weathered hand resting on the marble marker. Finally, he spoke in a voice so soft that only Emily Chen's camera microphone was able to capture it. "I made it, boys," he whispered to the silent graves surrounding him. "I made it home." The 80th anniversary ceremony that followed was unlike any D-Day commemoration in history. Frank Sullivan was given a place of honor on the reviewing stand, sitting between the President of the United States and the President of France. When he was introduced to the assembled crowd of world leaders, veterans, and families, the standing ovation lasted for 10 minutes. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came at the end of the ceremony, when Frank Sullivan was presented with a corrected military record showing that he had not died on Omaha Beach, but had survived, endured 2 years as a prisoner of war, and carried the memories of his fallen comrades for 80 years. Colonel Barnes and Captain Morrison were not court-martialed, as many had expected. Instead, they were personally counseled by Colonel Hartley and required to write formal letters of apology to Frank Sullivan. More importantly, they were assigned to work with Emily Chen on developing new protocols for authenticating elderly veterans, ensuring that no future heroes would face the dismissal and humiliation that Frank Sullivan had endured. The story of Frank Sullivan became international news, but not as a tale of military bureaucracy gone wrong. Instead, it became a powerful reminder that heroes come in unexpected forms, that the most important stories are often carried by the most unlikely people, and that respect and dignity should be offered freely, not withheld until proof is provided. Frank Sullivan lived for 3 more years after that D-Day anniversary, long enough to see his Medal of Honor recommendation approved and to attend the ceremony at the White House where the president draped the nation's highest military decoration around his neck. He spent those final years speaking to school groups and military audiences, not about his heroism, but about the importance of remembering the men who didn't make it home. When Frank Sullivan finally passed away at the age of 102, his funeral at Arlington National Cemetery was attended by thousands. The headstone that replaced the memorial marker in Normandy bore a simple inscription: PFC Frank J. Sullivan, 116th Infantry, Medal of Honor, survivor of Omaha Beach. He remembered them all. Emily Chen's documentary, The Last Man Standing, won an Academy Award and became required viewing at military leadership courses around the world. But she always said that the most important lesson from Frank Sullivan's story wasn't about heroism or military history. It was about the danger of assumptions and the power of taking time to listen to the stories that elderly voices are trying to tell us before it's too late. The story of the old man who almost wasn't allowed into his own memorial service became a cautionary tale, a reminder that dignity and respect should be the default response to age and claimed service, and that sometimes the most important people in any room are the ones who look the least important. And on every June 6th thereafter, at D-Day commemorations around the world, military personnel were reminded of Frank Sullivan's story and trained to look beyond appearances, to listen carefully to elderly voices, and to remember that heroes don't always announce themselves with fanfare. Sometimes they come quietly, carrying worn envelopes and faded memories, asking for nothing more than the chance to honor the friends they never forgot.